And without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today, Rear Admiral Rommel Ong, who is an expert on the aspects of South China Sea, and of course, Philippines naval and security strategy. He's also a senior research fellow at the Ateneo School of Government, former vice commander of the Philippine Navy. So, Rommel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Oren, for inviting me in this webinar.
So I think the first question I want to ask you is kind of a descriptive one. Can you give us a short kind of introduction as to where we stand today when it comes to the tensions between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea region, specifically talking about the conflicted area or the area that are the ones in which there are clashes between the two?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think it's better if I give the broad strokes of the challenges faced the Philippines in this region. And of course, coming from the Navy, I'm going to give you a Navy bias with respect to the perspective. Okay. Now, my take here is that China has this regional ambition, maritime ambition, and part of that ambition requires a maritime strategy. And in this case, China wants to assert or establish effective sea control over the North, the East, and the South China Sea. So I look at this as one single theater of operations, not just the South China Sea, but you have to look at also at what's happening in the other parts of East Asia as well. As far as the Philippines is concerned, my take is we're looking at the China threat not only coming from the South China Sea, but rather on a 360-degree perspective. We are also concerned with what's happening in Taiwan because it impacts us with respect to the northern Philippines. We are, although we are personally, I am concerned about what is happening in the Solomon Islands and in the Pacific, although that situation has not yet gained traction within the strategic community here in the Philippines. It's something that is considered far off. But for me, that is something that is I am concerned about because the east side of the Philippine archipelago historically is what we consider as our strategic rear. Okay, nothing happens in that area except for typhoons. But with the developments there in Solomon Islands, now we have to also look at the east side as well as an area of concern or an area of maritime interest. Now, looking much more inward, our problem from China comes from two vectors. Okay, the hard power part is what we obviously see transpiring in the South China Sea. And the hard power part manifests in terms of how they employ their Navy, Coast Guard, and the militia in terms of coercive actions or coercive tactics directed towards not only the Philippines, but other coastal states around South China Sea. The other vector would be the sharp power part. And this is in the form of malign influence operations or malign foreign interference, which is targeted at our domestic politics, our economy, and other aspects of what is normally we call what transpires in a normal liberal democratic state that are being challenged by authoritarian types of action or influence. So I think that in a nutshell sort of encapsulates the challenges faced by the Philippines vis-a-vis China.
When do you think this shift in policy or shift in situation emerged? Because that wasn't always the case, right? Like this is something that is evolved, and some people say that it's entirely interlinked to change in leadership in China. Do you agree with that? Do you see that as being the driver of this situation escalation?
My benchmark is 2012. That's That's my benchmark for escalation or the start of escalation of China's actions. And of course, what is significant about 2012, that is the ascendance of Xi Jinping to power. Okay, we had problems with Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin and even Deng Xiaoping during their period of leadership in the party, but never as problematic as we are now in our situation we face with Xi Jinping in power.
And can you give me a little bit about what is the change that that has happened within the Filipino strategy as a result of this rise in the threat or rise in tensions with China? How did the Filipino government and the army and the navy how did they adapt and change because of these changes?
Okay, you must understand that the Philippines was beset with a domestic insurgency problem for several decades. And this is happening outside of our problem with China. This is something domestic. We were only fairly able to resolve our insurgency problem by the end of last year, okay? Where the armed forces are able to declare that they have significantly reduced the forces of the local communist insurgency in the Philippines to a point that it's already manageable or containable, and it's already now a police problem rather a military problem. So that is the backdrop of where we are, where we were for the past decades. We were focused on domestic issues, and with given the limited resources, political, economic, and military that the Philippines has, it has to focus on the domestic problem first. Okay, so now we are in transition. The Department of National Defense here in the Philippines has put forward what they call the concept of a Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense concept, the CADC. But my analogy here is the proverbial dinosaur. When the dinosaur brain tells the tail to move to the left, it's not going to move. That tail is not going to move as fast as you want. So it's gonna be moving in increments, and in the pace that's going to make you uncomfortable. Okay, so the transition is not something that is going to be easy, because we're going to have to shift on doctrine. We have to review our force structure, and of course, the more important one is in terms of capability, material or capability development. We're gonna need different tools for conventional warfare, as opposed to we were encountering insurgency mode for the past few decades.
So you touched the point I wanted to get to, which is capabilities. Where do you see capabilities changing on the side of the Philippines, and how do you think that will be perceived by China? Is that going to be considered an escalatory move, or is that going to be considered as something that is well understood within the context of the tensions that exist?
Well, we cannot frame capability development in the Philippines in terms of whatever China thinks, because if we go by that framing of our decisions, we're not going to develop at all, because we're going to be, our politicians, our political leadership will be afraid of escalating because China will get angry with us. Okay. If China is going to be the benchmark of our decision, China would prefer that we are ineffective, underdeveloped, and not able to be totally stripped of any ability to defend ourselves. So that's not going to be the proper framing of development. We need to look at what are the capabilities, minimum capabilities that we need to be able to at least provide a modicum of deterrence or strategic deterrence for our requirements. Now, on my own personal experience, when we were looking at the South China Sea as the theater of operations, In 2016, we recognized that the operational center of gravity was the People's Liberation Army Navy in the South Sea Fleet. Okay? At that time, the Coast Guard and the militia were not fully developed then as a very effective tools for maritime activities at that time in 2016. So we couldn't match China ship for ship. We do not have the industrial capacity that China has, okay, in terms of shipbuilding. And it's the same problem that the U.S. Navy face right now, matching China's shipbuilding capability. So what we came up with was what we call an asymmetric solution in 2016. Land-based anti-ship missile systems and a submarine program. The submarine program has not gained traction because our political leaders think it's too expensive. Okay, although we tried, but it's very hard to make a very effective decision on the part of our political leaders. For the land-based anti-ship missile system, we did succeed. That's why we bought the BrahMos anti-ship missile system from India. Okay, but it's an expensive system, and there's gonna be not enough of them if we look at it from the perspective of supply chain as well. Meaning you can only shoot X number of missiles with an X cube number of ships, and eventually you're gonna run out. Okay, so you would conserve those systems for high-value targets. But what about the low-value targets that are proliferating in the South China Sea? So personally, in conversation with some of the active guys in the Navy, we're looking at drone as a solution, particularly in light of the lessons learned and observation we made on the conflict in Europe, particularly versus Ukraine and Russia, and we see the effective use of drones by a non-existent Ukrainian Navy against the Black Sea Fleet. Okay, so that is a model of success that we're looking at. Particularly concerning for me would be the militia vessels. They are technically unarmed, but they can be used for other purposes as well. I'm looking at them as craft of opportunity for mine warfare if push comes to shove. Okay, so drones, particularly attritable drones, would be, I think, an effective countermeasure to the preponderance of force that we see here in the South China Sea. In last May 15th, during a Scarborough Shoal incident, in June 17 in Second Thomas Shoal, and much later in Sabina Shoal, we've seen Chinese tactics, Chinese swarming tactics or surging tactics come into play, wherein they deploy a mass of 40 to 50 mixed Navy, Coast Guard, militia vessels at any given area, and establish localized control of that area and blockade our movements for a period of time. So with that capability that they possess, we need to be more innovative in terms of addressing that problem or challenge in the future.
So we talked a little bit about capabilities here now. I want to move to alliances and potential partnerships. Where do you see the Philippines progressing with that? Is there some potential alliances or partnerships or collaborations that in the past were not considered and are considered today?
Okay, the bedrock of Philippine international engagement, of course, is the Philippine-U.S. alliance. Okay, that's one. For the past few years, even during the past administration, we've been working quietly on a trilateral between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. Okay, that gained fruition this year, and it manifested in that trilateral summit in Washington, D.C. It was attended by the President Marcos, President Biden, and the Prime Minister of Japan. So based on the trilateral summit, there were some security and economic commitments that were signed on by the three political leaders. Okay, we're also looking at other countries like Canada, Australia, and maybe South Korea. Okay, as potential partners as well. We do have active cooperation, maritime security cooperation with them as well. I'm also looking at the trilateral between the US, Japan, and South Korea. Okay, as another minilateral arrangement here in the region. Now, if we add one trilateral to another trilateral, it's going to be a sort of a quadrilateral as well, wherein you're looking at the Philippines with US, Japan, and of course South Korea. South Korea is the principal source of modern equipment for the Navy and the Air Force. As far as the Philippines is concerned, we source our equipment from there. Excuse me. Now we do have this strong bilateral engagement with Australia. We have a status of visiting forces with Australia. Then we recently signed the reciprocal access agreement with Japan, although our Senate needs to sign on that agreement as well. Okay. We have problems with ASEAN, and that's why my personal take on this is, and I wrote an op-ed on this, is number one, ASEAN is not designed to be a military alliance. It never was, and it'll never be. It's a socio-economic, cultural institution. It serves its purpose by preventing or mitigating any potential conflict among the ASEAN member states. But looking at ASEAN as a countervailing institution against external problems like China, I think that would be difficult. And considering also the efficacy of China's geo-economic engagement with most of the ASEAN member states, they have basically, I think, worked well with China in terms of trade and investments. Okay? So that's going to be hard to sort of disengage from. So I'm looking at what I call a Northeast Asian approach or Northeast Asian dialogue, and that covers actually Japan, South Korea, US, of course, Canada, and although it's not Northeast, Australia. The elephant in the room is Taiwan, and I think I do believe that the Philippines need to engage Taiwan, but of course, we do need to engage Taiwan, but of course within the parameters, because we do have a one China policy. So we could not engage Taiwan directly under a track one environment.
You touch a little bit about the bedrock of the Philippines' national security, which is the alliance with the U.S. Can you expand a little bit about how do you perceive the difference of the current administration from previous ones, and what do you think will be the difference under Trump? And I know that's a very difficult answer to a difficult question to answer, but how do you see the legacy of this relations with the U.S. continue under Trump?
Okay, of course. We had difficulty during the Obama administration, I think. The Scarborough Shoal standoff incident happened in 2012 during Obama's term. We worked well with President Trump during his first term, and I believe that Biden's policy actually is a continuation of Trump's policy during his first term. So I don't see any major change with the Trump's policy moving forward when he comes into power by next year. Okay. Now, my problem is not related directly to who's in charge, but rather some fundamentals within the US that makes it difficult for them to be relevant or responsive in whatever is developing in the East Asia. Number one, it's commitment with other parts of the world. We're talking of Europe, Middle East. Okay. And recently that manifests in terms of actually moving all its carrier battle groups away from East Asia to the Middle East. Okay, so that's number one, and it doesn't necessarily follow which president is in power. Okay, that can happen anytime. Second is I mentioned is earlier in the discussion is the industrial capacity, particularly of the U.S. Navy, which according to the U.S. Congressional Research Service report, I think sometime in 2020, they reported that as early as 2015, the PLA Navy has already surpassed the U.S. Navy in terms of combatant vessels. When you say combatant vessels, that refers to carriers, the totality of carrier, destroyer, frigate, corvettes, submarines, okay, excluding transport ships. So considering also that the U.S. Navy is globally deployed and the PLA Navy is just focused here in the region. So you can now see that the problem here is the what I call the regional imbalance of naval power. Even if you couple together the total number of assets that the like-minded states or democracies in Asia put together, it's still not going to challenge the numbers. I'm talking of numbers of ships that the PLA Navy, Coast Guard, and militia combined has and can deploy at any part of the Northeast or South China Seas at any given time. Okay. Then there's the potential for what we fear would be a modus vivendi between US and China at any given time. It can happen for political or economic reasons. That is something that we factor in our consideration as well.
Do you perceive a potential situation related to Taiwan in which the Philippines will be, I don't want to use the word force, but will be drifted to or guided to or escalated to take part of U.S. operations related to Taiwan?
Okay, I mentioned about Chinese malign influence and malign foreign interference activities. It happens here in the Philippines, and our major concern is Chinese influence activities in northern Philippines. And northern Philippines is just as adjacent to Taiwan, where we see significant activities, particularly during the past administration, during the time of President Duterte. We've seen them engage local officials. We've seen China invest in strategic areas as well. Okay, our reading of this is like China is trying to establish a foothold in northern Philippines by non-military means, basically through economic investments and political influence. And I believe that that would be one way of, in military terms, you're trying to shape your battle space, but not in the military sense, but rather in the political and economic sense. Such that I believe that they do have significant local influence that would prevent, let's say, Philippines or our U.S. ally from actually operating in that part of the country. Okay, I believe that in any Taiwan scenario, the decisive point would be Bashi Channel. That's the waterway between Taiwan and the Philippines. And for that decisive point to be effectively controlled, China will have to, from a military sense, occupy some of Philippine Islands and northern part. Okay, and I believe that the most likely objective of any military activity in southern Taiwan would be the port of Kaohsiung. Now, from our end, from the Philippine side, port of Kaohsiung is important to us because if we need to evacuate Filipinos from Taiwan, that will be the egress of our nationals from Taiwan coming into the Philippines. And I believe other foreign nationals would use that as an egress as well and jump to the Philippines for evacuation, non-combatant evacuation activities as well. Okay, so your question is, are we looking at getting involved? I think that the fact that China has taken interest in northern Philippines before means that they've already considered that part of the country to be part of their strategic planning. At least that's my sense.
A difficult question, not so much because it's complicated, just because it's a bit looking into projectioning. But do you think there is a movement from China towards an operation in Taiwan based on everything you just told me, and from looking in from the Filipino angle of things and from the naval aspects of things?
Well, I think if they play the long game, they just wait it out. Somebody, I couldn't remember who, told me that if they just wait it out and allow the demographics to play itself out, then maybe the younger Taiwanese nationals would actually prefer a closer ties with the mainland China. Okay, so that would resolve itself sort of culturally and politically by itself. I think there's no reason for China to actually move towards a more kinetic, more ambitious plan against Taiwan right now. Although we've seen the optics of exercises around Taiwan, which is, I think, a harbinger of how they will actually conduct their operations. Is basically to isolate Taiwan from the rest of the world. Okay, physically, and maybe through cyber disrupt government and military activities within Taiwan.
When you look at the Filipino strategy, looking as a projection for the next 5 to 10 years, and you take into account what we just discussed about, which is the Taiwanese angle, the Chinese interference, and so on, where do you see this strategy shifting or changing from where it is now?
Definitely, the Philippines does not have the gravitas to deal with China on its own. That's a given, whether it's diplomatic or military or economic. So, as we can develop our own capabilities as much as we can, but on our own, it's going to be difficult. So that means we need to work on building alliances and partnerships with other like-minded states in the region, in the hope that with this coalition of like-minded states would be sufficient to give China second thoughts, or maybe alter its behavior even for a little in terms of changing its calculations. Okay, so that's being pessimistically optimistic okay, in terms of strategy.
So we do see, and you touched that, and I wanted to get to it. We do see information operations of China in the Philippines in different sorts of capacity. And I know that the Philippines is also applying what is called full transparency strategy as a way to kind of project what China is doing, but also as a way to counter some of those stuff. How do you perceive those operations by China in terms of, are they successful? Are they do they have an impact? Like, how do you perceive the results of those information operations that China is conducting in the Philippines?
Okay, just to give you a background, we discern an uptick of Chinese propaganda, or the start of the Chinese propaganda war with China sometime April of last year. Now, April was important because that was a time when our President Marcos announced the additional 4 EDCA sites. And that was just about the same time that Secretary Lloyd Austin visited the Philippines and sort of recommitted on the alliance, and as well as announced certain new commitments with respect to the alliance. I think that was the 2+2 during that time. So what we noticed was in April of last year, there was an uptick of Chinese propaganda here in the Manila, and the narrative then was sort of leaning towards a pro-China narrative. But it didn't work, so we saw a shift sometime August of last year, when the narrative changed to anti-war type of narrative, meaning let's not fight China, we're gonna go to war with China if we do this or do that. Okay. Now, in terms of looking at whether it's successful or not, I think we're fairly doing well in terms of counter propaganda. By putting forward, you mentioned about the transparency initiative. That was one way of highlighting what is happening on the ground, actually, and sort of actually belie all the allegations that China has made in both international and domestic media from their end. Okay. Now, Chinese propaganda has 3 vectors from what I can discern. The first one will be coming from Beijing, whether to the foreign ministry or state media. The second one would be coming from the Chinese embassy here in Manila. And the third one would be coming from Filipinos who, for one reason or another, only they know, support the Chinese narrative and spout the Chinese party line. Okay, so those 3 vectors are where we're looking at in terms of defending the public opinion space here in Manila. Are we winning? I think yes, because if we go by the reputable survey firms here in Manila, the general public, about 80 to 90% support the government's actions in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. And they do support government's efforts to actually protect our sovereign rights. Okay, and as well as they do agree with the idea of modernizing our armed forces, particularly the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Air Force, in addressing the problem we face in the South China Sea. Next year, we will have our local elections. It's a local election. And for the first time, foreign policy will become a domestic issue when we have local elections. So local politicians here who spout the Chinese line will have difficulty in the polls in the elections. So either they hide their true intent or be confident in taking a more nationalist perspective or posture with respect to their campaigning. Okay, so essentially what I'm trying to say is I think we're succeeding because the needle hasn't moved to the benefit of China with respect to when we measure the effectiveness or the KPIs of their propaganda directed towards the Philippines and to the Filipino general public.
How much do you think should the Philippines be worried about those Chinese campaigns? I mean, I know you're saying it looks like the Philippines are winning, and and you mentioned some of the success, but looking at this as something that is not going away and probably going to be surfacing again and again. What do you think? Is that something that the Philippines should take more seriously than it is, or maybe they are taking it seriously, but the resources are not enough? So what do you think should the Philippines do from this regard? Like, are they taking it serious enough?
Are you talking of the counter propaganda effort or
Yes,
the entire
the counter propaganda efforts against China's information operations campaigns.
Okay, I never said that we're gonna stop defending or
No,
countering.
of course.
Okay, so it's the battle of narrative in the public opinion space is a continuing effort. Okay, we may have some operational pause, but I think they're not gonna let up. Particularly when we are going to have our elections next year. And what I am personally watching out for is any indications of covert foreign political interference in terms of our electoral process. Okay, so my sense is that our elections will come is a battle space as well.
A question that we received from the crowd, and I want to touch on it, which is related to the relationship between the Philippines and Vietnam within the context of the tensions with China. Where do you see these relations between the two countries within the context of confrontation with China and collaboration vis-a-vis China's efforts in the region?
Okay, based on my personal experience when I was still in the active service, we do have very strong relation with the Vietnamese Navy. Okay, and we do have a very strong engagement. In fact, we do annual, I would say it, athletic activities in this Pratic group of islands. Whenever the weather permits, we do have annual athletic activities, okay, which we do interchangeably over the year. We have signed a maritime security cooperation agreement with Vietnam, I think, following the visit of President Marcos in Vietnam sometime of January of this year. We have initiated exercises between our respective coast guards following that security cooperation agreement as well. We have a working constructive engagement with Vietnam in dealing with IUUF issues as well that affects both our countries, particularly the Philippines. So yeah, I think we are good in terms of Vietnam. Among the ASEAN member states, Vietnam is one of the members that the Philippines has worked well, despite the situation we find ourselves in vis-a-vis China.
In terms of the relationships that the Philippines have with the Asian organization, China is actively seeking to, I would say, to dismantle, or won't dismantle, but to force a strategy in which the organization is not as coherent and China is more working on a bilateral with country by country basis and not vis-a-vis the organization. Where do you see the Asian organization fit into the Philippine strategy when it comes to confronting with China? Where you mentioned that they're not a military organization, but where do they fit in the overall scheme of things?
Number one, we have to accept that China successfully divided ASEAN. Okay, I think as I mentioned earlier, the efficacy of China's geo-economic strategy in ASEAN has worked well for them and has allowed them to exert some form of leverage over the different ASEAN member state capitals, particularly in terms of influencing the political and economic elites of these countries. Okay, that said, I believe that we made some mistakes as well. Number one, we could have engaged ASEAN, at least most of the ASEAN member states, here in the that are surrounding the South China Sea more effectively. We could have consulted them with our actions because basically they do not agree with our China policy. Okay. But I am not optimistic that we can move the needle in terms of actually convincing ASEAN member states to agree with us with respect to how we deal with our regional concerns. Okay, so that's a done deal. One of the other problems is that it's difficult for the US, the United States, to exert some form of even soft power influence over the region. ASEAN expects, desires US to open up and allow for free trade agreements. But I believe that, I do believe that it's something that is not palatable to the US public, particularly in terms of its domestic political leadership. Okay. So that's not going to happen. So I think that's the weakness in US ability to influence ASEAN that China's taken advantage of. So I'm looking at other middle powers in the region, like maybe Japan, who has been very supportive of ASEAN and has been well liked and accepted in the ASEAN capitals as the proxy, as an alternative to convey soft power influence over the region to countervail Chinese influence. The other one I'm looking at would be India. If it can get its act together, maybe it can compete with China in terms of actually economic engagement with the ASEAN, just so that there's enough competition going around. Okay. So that's how I look at ASEAN, and I'm not actually optimistic right now.
You mentioned Japan. How does the Philippines view Japan's military modernization process within the context of what we have discussed, which is the South China Sea tensions? Because on the one hand, there is obviously historical grievances between the countries. There's also obviously the concern of military, or I would say a spiral of an arms race in the region. But on the other hand, it seems that a lot of the countries want Japan to be more involved in the security architecture in order to counterbalance China and in order to provide more options for security deliberations. So where do you see the Japanese armament program within this context?
Okay, there are still residual issues with Japan arising from the Second World War, but this is something that is containable, that can be dealt with diplomatically and politically. Now, I mentioned about the trilateral arrangement or emerging trilateral engagement between the Philippines, the US, and Japan earlier. I'm a personal advocate of that because I believe that given the current weaknesses of the US, particularly the US Navy in East Asia, I look at Japan as the middle power that can mitigate that weakness when we deal with China. Okay, so I do personally, I do agree and I do concur with the efforts of Japan to modernize its self-defense, because it's not a military organization. The self-defense forces to be at least to try to be at par with some aspect of Chinese capabilities here. The missing piece, I think, would be we need to develop an integrated missile defense system to deal with the Chinese A2AD capability. Okay. And that is something that needs to be worked out as well.
There is a Chinese view which is concerned about this Asian NATO alliance potential. And that's maybe a little bit how they push a narrative to object against any alliances, being what they perceive or being what they want to project in from their own, in order to achieve their own goals. But where do you see a possibility for a kind of an Asian or Southeast Asia or NATO to confront China as something that is not underneath only the American umbrella, but separately? Do you think that's something that can be emerging and rising, or do you think that's something that is not something that's being discussed at the moment?
I think that was one of the ideas that I've also been working around with. And if there is going to be a sort of an informal as Asian NATO, the natural leader of that on the construct would be Japan, I think. To me, Japan, like the Philippines, is a resident middle power in East Asia. Okay, we have the same calculations and the same proximate issues with China. Okay, of course, Japan is much more, has more resources to deal with China militarily. But if you're going to look at the region, I'm looking at least three spheres of cooperation led by the three Quad members outside of the United States. Okay, so here in East Asia, I think the logical quote-unquote leader will be Japan. Then I'm looking at India to take the lead in the Indian Ocean with some, if not all, the ASEAN member states in continental ASEAN. Okay. Then I'm looking at Australia to take the lead in the Mid-Pacific along with France, considering the problem that I voiced out earlier in the discussion about Chinese establishing a footprint in Solomon Islands and the other Mid-Pacific states. I believe that the Chinese maritime strategy right now is to gain foothold in the ex-US and Japanese naval and air bases during the Second World War, and that is the one driving their influence of operations in the Mid-Pacific. Okay, so if we have these three spheres of cooperation led by each of the three Quad members outside of the United States, so we're not dealing with a single Asian NATO, but actually three working on their respective spheres of cooperation.
We spoke about a lot about capabilities and alliances. I wanna ask a little bit about in terms of the scenarios for potential de-escalation. So we were talking a lot from the context of how this situation has kind of a dynamics that looks like they're going towards more escalatory and confrontational. But where do you see de-escalation scenario enter into this discussion? Do you think that's possible? Do you think there is certain changes that are coming that might de-escalate the tensions?
As long as China enjoys escalation dominance, the only way China will accept a de-escalation is in the form of appeasement. Okay, meaning we totally agree with what they want. Okay, so what is theirs is theirs. What is ours is also theirs. Okay, that would be their paradigm. Okay, so we need to break the escalation dominance first before we can even consider talking about de-escalation. Or I believe that China would be open to even look at de-escalation. Right now, because they enjoy escalation dominance, they sort of dictate the tempo. Okay. So again, in short, what I'm saying is we need to find a way to disrupt escalation dominance first.
And how would you do that? What's the required actions and by whom? I'm guessing the United States is the predominant actor, but what are the actions that a new U.S. administration needs to take in order to uh, in order to engage China or confront China in such a way that will reduce the escalation dynamics that we're seeing?
Well, I think the first is we need to agree on what is our strategy. Okay. And this is not a strategy for the Philippines alone, but rather, or the US alone, but rather a collective strategy of like-minded states. So to me, it's either we work on a denial strategy or a cost imposition strategy uh, among this collective or coalition, uh, and targeting it basically to maybe, if you look at cost imposition, maybe the Chinese maritime base economy, configuring the way we respond to Chinese escalation or actions by deterring or acting against its vulnerability, which I believe is the fact that 95% of its economy is based on maritime trade.
So we're reaching the end of this webinar, and I wanted to ask you if you can question I ask everybody, which is, if there's a question I didn't ask you, what do you think? What is the topic or aspect that we haven't discussed today that you think is critical when it comes to the topics of the tension in the South China Sea region?
Well, honestly, I think we covered most of the important parts. But again, maybe just to emphasize a point that we need to work together. Uh, uh, Chinese strength is built on the weaknesses of the other states. Okay? And we're not gonna see a peaceful region until we get our act together. Okay? If you're looking for my last word.
All right. So with this comment, I want to thank you so much for participating in today's webinar, for your insight, for the explanation, and for the clarity that you provided us about this topic, and really a region and dynamics that are not usually explored as much as they should. I think this has been very interesting, a lot more to explore. And again, this is for those of you who join us today, this is part of the series of webinars that we've been doing as post-US elections, although we have planned this way before. So definitely this is one of those things that those webinars that we wanted to conduct after the elections, because we wanted to see how those elections will impact the situation. So Rommel, thank you so much for your time today and for the explanation. Much appreciated. And thank you everyone who joined us.
Thank you, Oren.
Thank you.